Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in our week of Viva Italia, a celebration of the finest and rarest wines in Italy. My name is John Capon. I'm the chairman and owner of Acker Wines. We're very excited to have a thrilling two-day auction tonight and tomorrow night. As a matter of fact, tomorrow night being a great selection of Italian wines, probably the greatest selection of Italian wines ever to come to auction, including direct consignments from 5 of Italy's most important domains. I'm joined by Lily Mirabelle Friedman, my co-host in all the virtual tastings and Acker's own superstar, my pandemic pal. Lily, how are you doing?
Nice to see you again, John.
And of course, it is with great pleasure that we introduce to you a man who needs no introduction, but will get one nonetheless, a German gentleman who sought his vinous schooling in Bordeaux before spending years at many top chateaux, including Chateau Palmer. I remember a great lunch with you way back at Chateau Palmer myself. And the man who has been deeply rooted in the fabulous Bolgheri region in Italy since 2004. He's fluent in 4 languages and actually a 5th, great Cabernet. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to you the estate director of Ornellaia, Axel Heinz. Welcome, Axel.
Well, thanks for having me, John. Hi to everybody.
It is great to have you here. Where are you coming to us from right now?
Well, I am sitting right in the tasting room, in one of the tasting rooms of the estate with a bit of a panoramic view. Maybe the sunshine is, I don't know how you guys see the backdrop, the sunlight, the typical Bolgheri sunlight is maybe a little bit strong. So I don't know if you can really see the backdrop with the hills of Bolgheri behind me. This is the place where we're usually doing our blending sessions, all our technical tasting. So this is pretty much, the center stage for many of our decisions we have to take when it comes to making wine.
And how's the weather in 2021 so far?
It's great now. Yesterday would have been quite a different picture because we had a terrifyingly rainy day yesterday, but then, you know, it's still early May, so that's fine. A little bit of rain is better now than in 3 months' time. So we've had a quite good growing season so far. We had our share of cold temperatures at the beginning of April and just barely escaped spring frost apart from some really very remote places. But most of our vineyards are fine. So we're looking forward to a normal year. And so far, weather is mostly, apart from yesterday, mostly being nice, sunny. So the vines are looking good. And well, I suppose that in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be in flowering. So that will be the first indication as to how early or late the harvest potentially might turn out to be.
Very good, very good. So you were born in Munich, Germany, and raised in Munich. And after high school, you decided to go to Bordeaux.
That's right.
What made you make that decision?
You know, thanks for your great introduction. There was maybe just the one thing missing that explains it all. It's that my mother is actually from Bordeaux. My mother's family is from Bordeaux. I actually do have both citizenships, German and French. And so, you know, when you are exposed, when you travel to Bordeaux, that's where I typically spend my summer holidays, for most of the times closer to the beach than to the vineyards, obviously. But at some point, there's no point escaping wine. And so I discovered wine through my family and fell in love with it. And so that was a good excuse to move to Bordeaux once I finished high school. And the other thing is I was surprised to learn that you didn't need to be necessarily born into a, you know, 20th generation winemaking family to be able to make wine. You could just sign up, you know, for university and study it. So that was a huge surprise to me. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like an interesting thing. And so I went to Bordeaux, studied, worked in different places in the Médoc and Saint-Emilion. And then came the offer from Ornellaia, which sounded equally exciting. And yeah, I left without knowing how long it would last. And now I'm in my 16th harvest. So, you know, it's been obviously a nice match and a great love story.
Yeah, it's been an amazing run you've had. I mean, the quality of the wines at Ornellaia, I mean, they were always good, but I think since you've arrived and taken over, I mean, they've just gone up another level and are, clearly some of the best wines made in Italy today. So congratulations and kudos to you for all your hard work. And so when you were growing up, your parents were drinking wine regularly, so it was just a common thing around the house on the dinner table. I guess you were trying wine in your youth, a little taste here and there, or taking a half
Yes, it was. It was. I must say, my parents would drink wine, but it used to be terrible usually. So it wasn't particularly good wine. I think they won't be upset if I tell you that I basically taught them how to drink nice wines. But in Bordeaux, in the family, there would always be, some great uncle who would go down in his cellar and bring up a dusty bottle. It may not always have been super exquisite, great Grand Cru Classé Bordeaux, but there I started to learn that there was something special about wine. That it was not just something, just a casual drink. There was something. It was a big deal. It was important. There would be fights around the opening time. Should you open way before? Should it be decanted or not? And I kind of figured, there must be something a little bit more special about wine when people make all that ceremonial and all that big deal around opening a bottle of wine. And when I was starting to be European, let's say drinking age, which is basically, officially 18 years, but it somehow starts a little bit earlier when you get your for dinner on Sunday, you get your glass of wine, you're being introduced. So I realized really that indeed there was something very special about wine. So that's how the connection built itself up quite spontaneously, really.
Was there that one epiphany, that one wine that you had that you were like, damn, this is something I gotta get more of and get into here?
Yeah, there were few, there was. It's not always been the greatest wines, but when you taste something consciously and say, wow, this is something really exceptional. I remember with my uncle, who was a chef in Switzerland, bringing me to his cellar and say, tell me what the two best bottles in my cellar are. And so, if you don't know, you look at the labels. There was a 75 Mouton, there was a 61 Climence, and I said, those are, you're already a snob. But he said, we're going to taste them anyway. And the next would be, it was not only Bordeaux, it was, I think, the first glass of serious white Burgundy was a kind of super epiphany, because it kind of suggested, I thought white wine was a rather simple and straightforward drink, and in comes that I didn't know that white wine could be something as layered and as complex as that.
And you, in fact, wrote your master's in agronomy. Am I saying that right, Lily?
Yeah, right.
On Chardonnay, right? So, but you went to the world of red wine. You abandoned your first true love.
Well, I mean, it was. Yeah, it's true. But that's what is. When you're in Bordeaux, there's no way around red wine.
Right.
And I never made a white wine in Bordeaux. I had to go to Bolgheri into Tuscany to finally have the occasion to make some white wines.
Right. Very nice. Well, we have a lot of wines to taste through today. So Lily, why don't you set the table and introduce our first wine and some questions for Axel.
Well, we'll start with the two Serre Nuove, which is the true second wine of Ornellaia, which is my understanding. You, particularly in your tenure, you've certainly expanded the portfolio of Ornellaia a bit and included several white wines now that did not used to exist as part of the range. So it's been commercially released since 1997, and from my research, it's been a similar blend of Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Petit Verdot. But how would you describe the process of making Serre Nuove as opposed to Ornellaia?
It's something that had to somehow grow through time, because Ornellaia is such a young estate. So we decided to introduce this wine with vintage 1997. Which was a first, let's say, turning point at the estate, because we had planted the first set of vineyards in the early 1980s. So those were, if not old vineyards, then at least adult vineyards. And in the beginning of the 1990s, we'd expanded and planted further vineyards. At the same time, Ornellaia was starting to really acquire serious reputation. So we thought the time was right to introduce a second wine, which was not a concept that was very typical for Tuscany at the time, nor is it probably today. So the first, as always with second wines, the first idea was we need something to select the very best fruit for Ornellaia to make the best possible wine, and then we'll see with the Serre Nuove. Obviously, with time, I think it is important and it is critical to make the second wine something with an individual style, with an individual character, which has a link to Ornellaia itself, because it's the same philosophy, it's the same estate, it's the same approach. It's just a slightly different angle on the wines and of the styles of Ornellaia. So obviously with Serre Nuove, we aim at something that is a little bit more immediately approachable, which gives you the choice for early drinking or a bit of aging if you want to, because it's a serious wine. So we wanted to have maybe not quite as long an aging capacity as Ornellaia, but still it should be a wine that not only has the capacity to age, but also to improve with age. Stylistically, it's not true in every vintage, it tends to be a little bit more focused on Merlot than Cabernet Sauvignon, as opposed to Ornellaia, where the blend is usually dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon. A little bit of shorter aging, a little bit less new oak, because the wine obviously is not quite the power and structure of Ornellaia, but really it's a sort of slightly different angle to Ornellaia, a more friendly, a more immediate expression of the terroir of Ornellaia.
So John, how's that 14 drinking?
Drinking really well. I mean, like you said, I mean, it's very approachable. I mean, it's still a young wine that has good structure and body and concentration, but there's, you know, I don't feel like it's too young. I'm enjoying it, actually. I mean, it's just really, it's a real pleasure to drink. Tell us about 2014 and in Bolgheri. And are the vintages in Bolgheri, does it kind of track with the vintages of Tuscany? Because it's really a unique climate. And I want you to get into Bolgheri a lot, because people think, oh, Tuscany, go to Florence, you're there. But really, Bolgheri, I mean, it's far. I went to see you there a couple of years ago for a very special day. And, you know, it's far. It's like 2 hours from Florence, and you're closer to the water, really, right?
We're very close to the sea. And you have a point, because there is not always the same vintage expression in Bolgheri than the rest of Tuscany. There are several reasons to that. The closeness to the sea is certainly one that makes for a very tempered, very mild climate. There's also a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, which tend to ripen a little bit earlier than Sangiovese, way up in the hills of Chianti. So let's say the important phase in a vintage in Bolgheri is the period between the 15th of August and the 15th of September. That's the weather conditions that make a great vintage or not in Bolgheri specifically. Whereas if you go further inland, if you go to Montalcino and Chianti with Sangiovese, the critical part would more be 15th of September to 15th of October. So according to how the season goes in the early part of harvest or in the late part of harvest, the vintages can turn out to be quite different on the coast, in Bolgheri and further inland. There are some great examples of vintages that have been, broadly speaking, overlooked in most of Tuscany, and which have been really great in Bolgheri. I can think of 98, which is not considered typically a great vintage in Tuscany, and yet in Bolgheri the 98s are probably superior to the 97s, which are today almost a mythical vintage. So there are these kinds of differences. Sometimes there is a coincidence. I mean, some, generally speaking, great vintages have been great all over Tuscany, 2010, 2001, more recently 2015 and 2016, they have been great everywhere. And in the case of 2014, one has to admit that they were challenging vintages all over. It was a challenging year all over Tuscany, with probably always that advantage that, you know, when it comes to Merlot particularly, but also in a Cabernet Sauvignon, There is still in a slightly more complicated vintage potential to ripen them out sufficiently, which was very much what took place in 2014 as far as we are concerned. It wasn't an easy year. It was the opposite of a normal vintage. Usually you can have, mixed weather in the spring. It can be hot and dry, it can be rainy and cold. Harvest can be a mixed bag as well. But the single thing you can usually rely on, that the summer is going to be there. It's going to be hot, it's going to be dry, it's going to be sunny. And yet 2014 was the exact opposite. Everything was fine in spring and during harvest, only the summer was terrible. So that was the challenge. So really August was all rain and gray weather, no sunshine. So we almost lost an entire month to ripening, and we had to catch up with it as much as possible in September and October. Quite luckily, we had a good month of September, and most of October was nice too. So we could give the grapes the time to really ripen out, and it made for wines that are midweight, that are not probably the longest lived wines we've ever produced. But the positive side is that if you open a bottle of 2014 now, and that's particularly true with Serre Nuove, you're in for a wine that is already really a joy to drink in a slightly more delicate style. But I think this is a wine I would definitely drink with a lot of pleasure today. No risk in seeing it falling apart in the next few years, but it's definitely now in the next 5 to 10 years, these are wines that are perfectly enjoyable and nice to drink.
Well, it's those challenging years. It's almost beneficial to the consumer, because you want to drink wines like this at an early age, or when they're released and they come out, and to wait to have to wait 10, 20 years, especially as the world gets more digital, and people don't have the same attention span or that patience that they used to. So I'm always like a fan of if every year was a great year, wine would be I think there's two things. If every year was like one of these vintages of the century, it would be boring, because then you have to wait for everything, and you can't the differences in personalities and such. But also, I think the technology and the information and the knowledge about making wine today is greater than ever before. So I think with that, I mean, it's almost like great winemaker never makes a bad wine. And you're certainly a great winemaker. So, you see that in a vintage like 2014.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have, with the effects of climate change, we're enjoying a strain of vintages which are all great years, but the profile tends to be quite concentrated and rich wines that really deserve and need cellaring.
Right.
So while it's great to have a frequency of great years, at some point you also want to have in between something that you can enjoy as a young wine at an early stage, while you're waiting for the other vintages to come around in the cellar. So 2014, if well managed, is definitely one of those vintages that gives immediate pleasure and allows you to wait for some more powerful and robust vintages.
Right. And speaking of the blend of the wine, and is it generally the same as Ornellaia? There's a little different? Do they kind of stay same from vintage to vintage, or do you play around with that? What's the blend in the 14?
Well, that is, in 14 we have a quite typical blend for Les Serre Nuove. It's about 50% Merlot, and usually the Merlot tends to be the dominating grape variety in the blend of Les Serre Nuove. Typically, I would say anywhere between 40 and 60%. Then second comes around 30-ish Cabernet Sauvignon, and then Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. In Ornellaia, it tends to be the other way around. It's more like 50 to 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, then Merlot, Cabernet Franc, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, and we have an example of that, you always have to adjust a little bit to the nature of each vintage. And sometimes in specific vintages, that general rule can be obviously a little bit turned upside down, not completely. I don't see anytime soon, Ornellaia becoming a blend that is 80% Merlot or so. But sometimes, there have been vintages where cooler vintages, later ripening vintages, where there's a slightly higher proportion of Merlot in the blend of Ornellaia, and therefore, the Cabernet becomes a little bit more dominant in the Serre Nuove. It's really depending specifically on each vintage. But in 14, we have a fairly typical example from that point of view for the Serre Nuove, solid 50% of Merlot. In 2018, which is the following wine, it's almost equal proportions of Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon.
Okay.
And much less comparatively with 18% Cabernet Franc and 17% Petit Verdot. So it seemed like in that year, and you can tell us a little bit more about 2018 at this juncture, but it seems like for the vintage, there was a lot of kind of course correction to be made or to alter it and make it so it was still kind of the wine that you wanted.
It's definitely a vintage that is a very nice surprise to us, because initially it had a quite tough growing season, very rainy growing season, and everything, went for the better only from late July on, and then we had a good summer, we had good months of September. But the profile of the wines was a little bit different to what we're used to see, because there was little drought. So usually we're always, when we're getting ready for harvest, we always have that period of 1.5 months, 2 months, where it virtually doesn't rain, when it gets hot. So we have to deal with highly concentrated fruit, just find the right balance. Do I pick it before it gets too rich and too concentrated or too ripe? Do I wait for everything to be textbook perfect? In 18, that was a little bit different. There was the fruit was not hugely concentrated, but at the same time we could wait a little bit longer to pick, and definitely the blend and the creativity, I would say, during the blending was one of the key elements in 2018 to, I think, get the best out of this vintage. And it makes for wines that are a bit unusual, probably particularly the Serre Nuove, because, 18% or 17% of Petit Verdot, that might sound a little bit scary. It just turns, it fit well, because those were wines, most of the, definitely the Merlots, but also the Cabernet Sauvignon were not hugely structured. So you could go with higher proportions of Cabernet Sauvignon, of Petit Verdot, and to some extent Cabernet Franc than what you usually do, definitely. Yes. So yes, it's true, it's a little bit atypical, but it's the secret when you're working with different terroirs and different grape varieties, to be able to slightly go a different path when the vintage requires that.
It's quite good. I mean, it's still, you can get a little of that inkiness from the Petit Verdot and that structure, but you don't notice it dominating like the flavor profile or anything. It's quite tasty. There's a nice richness to it. And I mean, still, it's very young, but there's still a drinkability to it again in the blend that's quite charming.
It is quite, I think, one of the I think the 18th, generally speaking, if we compare them to 14, let's say, they have more body, they have more structure, but they're still in this very engaging, quite soft, quite rounded profile, which makes them very approachable young. So I believe 18 is going to be another vintage with a huge drinking window, because honestly, the wines are young, but they taste great. So there's nothing wrong in enjoying a young wine still in its fruitful phase. When it's as expressive as that. I think they still have fairly nice aging potential. So it's one of these, typically, it takes 5 years maybe for the Serre Nuove to fully come around, can take 10, 15 years for Ornellaia to fully blossom. This is a vintage you can start to drink now, and it's still going to be great in another 10 or 15 years and beyond for Ornellaia.
Yeah, quite nice, quite really delicious. And so let's go back to growing up in Bordeaux a little bit before we get into the wines of Ornellaia. Do you feel like Bordeaux kind of how was your experience in Bordeaux, and did it kind of lead you to Bolgheri to seek something new? Did you kind of had enough of and you wanted a new challenge, or what was kind of the reason you made the change? Because it's a big jump. I mean, especially 20 years ago.
It was, and I must say that I didn't quite, well, it's not true that I didn't quite know what I was going into. I mean, the fact that I have both French and German background helped a lot, because having grown up in Munich, I got fairly early on exposed to Italian wines, which, late 80s, early 90s were already quite popular in Germany. So I learned drinking wine in Bordeaux. My first great examples of wines were wines from Bordeaux, but then very quickly I got into other wine regions, and definitely Italy was part of that. And I remember that my first glass of Ornellaia, my first taste of Ornellaia I had in Munich. I think it was 91 Ornellaia when it just came out. So while it was a bit of a jump into unknown territory, I knew very well what Ornellaia meant in the Italian wine landscape. And it was just, I felt it was the right move in terms of career. It was the type of estate I definitely aspire to work for. I probably thought that would happen in Bordeaux, but then, it sounded exciting. And for family reasons, I had not had the occasion to do like 2 or 3 harvests overseas, either in California, because I had to stay in Bordeaux. And so for me, that was the occasion, do my classes in Bordeaux and then travel abroad. And yeah, so that was a little bit what drove me there. And it was exciting because at the same time I said, okay, it's not too much of a jump because I know what Ornellaia is. I know the grape varieties are the same. And yet I had to learn that Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc do not behave exactly the same way in Bolgheri than they do in Pauillac and Saint-Emilion.
Interesting. And speaking of Bolgheri, you and the team at Ornellaia have spent considerable time mapping the vineyards and the region. I mean, talk to us about that. I mean, that's kind of an effort and a level that most wineries don't kind of get to. So talk to us about that process and what you learned about the region, about your vineyards.
It's at Ornellaia in Bolgheri, it's particularly exciting. It's still not finished because we're still going a little bit more into detail. We'll have a completely new soil study this year, which will take us about 2-3 years to do more in detailed mappings of the areas, of the different soil types, because first of all, as in most of Tuscany, it's incredible how abruptly and how frequently soils can change in few really yards distance, how exposition changes, and that all makes for a patchwork of different micro terroirs, which is really quite exciting. The second very exciting thing in a certain way is that in many places where we have vineyards, before us, there had been no vineyards. So there's no archive you can look into and collect data and learn from other people's experience. We have to really build our own database of information. So we do have now sort of, a little bit more than 30 years history, and that gives us some information, but we still feel we're discovering new territory each day, be it just because, maybe you've studied a vineyard for the last 10 years, but only now is it getting to that age where it really fully expresses the nature of its terroir. So it's a whole set of new experiences that come in every year. So that's very exciting. And I think we need, because we have not hugely long histories and great archives to rely on, we have to build our own archives. But that makes it's a sense of discovery, which is definitely very exciting.
Do you change, have you changed because of your discovery and the mapping and the soil study, do you say, oh, this section of land we really need to change to Petit Verdot, or this section of land we need to plant more Merlot? Does it kind of read that way or give that back to you?
Sometimes, yes. The difficult thing with the vineyard is that you're supposed to plant it and keep it for the next 50 years. So, sometimes we do have, it's true that not everything has been done in the right way. And in some place where there were really mistakes made, but they were made because of lack of experience, we have sometimes removed vineyards that we feel are too young to remove. But then, if it's obviously the wrong grape variety in the wrong place, then you have to sort it out. Sometimes there are situations that are a little bit in between. We have a feeling today that the choices that were made are probably not the best possible, but we're keeping the vineyard and say, okay, in 20 years time, when we're going to remove it, we'll know that we'll change the grape variety, we'll plant something else. So it's a little bit mixed, because, you know, planting a vineyard is always a long-term operation. So ideally you better get it right, but sometimes it's not. If it's not too blatantly wrong, you just get on with it, get along with it, try to make the best out of it, and then say, you know, maybe not me, but, you know, the ones who are going to follow me, I'd give them the right clues so that they get it right in the second replanting.
Right, right. And on that note, I think it's time for some Ornellaia itself. We have 3 vintages here. I'm very excited to taste. So Lily, why don't you set the framework for Ornellaia and get us started here?
So we're going to taste the 17, 15, and 13 in order from youngest to oldest, as per Axel's instructions. And since 2006, the estate has partnered with a unique artist in every vintage for a special label. I can see John holding it in his hand right now. John, you want to show us that one?
I have the Solare.
Exactly. So my understanding is that the images, the artist is supposed to kind of characterize the vintage with art. And Solare, as John said, refers to the intense heat of the vintage. How would you describe 17, Axel?
Well, you know, it was a bit, it's true what you said. We've, since 2006, actually, that project was born from the idea that each vintage has a specific character. Beyond the fact that it's a grade or a lesser vintage, we sometimes as producers also feel a bit frustrated by that sort of a little bit simplifying approach of vintage is either great or not so great. But in reality, even if a vintage is not great, it has a specific side of our territory, of our winemaking to express, which makes it unique in its own right. So the idea was to give names to each vintage, which somehow characterize in one word the main feature of the vintage. In 17, we tried to be a little bit provocative, because now, obviously, with the concerns around climate change, as soon as a vintage gets too warm, too hot, too dry, everybody almost freaks out a little bit and gets afraid of it. And at some point, that was happening in 2017 as well. But at a very early stage, in July, everybody was also already predicting a huge disaster. And I must say, we were among the only ones to raise our hands and say, why don't we just wait until we've made some wine to decide whether it's a disaster or not? And at the same time, I thought it's a little bit odd to think in a certain way that today we're so afraid from a dry or a hot or a sunny vintage. And I was just wondering, if you say to a winemaker like 30 years ago, you know, this is a year it's been dry, it's been sunny, it's been early ripening, probably the winemaker would have said, oh, this must be a great vintage. And today we've come to a point where we're almost afraid of such wines. It was definitely on the extreme side. It was not an easy vintage to manage, because it was terribly dry. There was the sun-dried concentrated fruit, which you had to treat very carefully in the winery. But I think there are a lot of positive sides to 2017 as well, if you were able to manage the excess that lay within the vintage. And I think it's a very good vintage. It's maybe not in the top 3 or 4 vintages of the last 15 or 20 years, but it's still a very good vintage. And it revendicates in a certain way its solar, sun, bathed character. So it's part of the personality of that wine. But I think that's what makes this wine so particular and interesting as well.
Yeah, there's a richness and a sweetness. You can kind of feel the sun in it, but it's not sun baked or over the top, you know. But at the same time, compared to the Serre Nuove, from my standpoint, it's like, okay, yes, this is a great wine, but I want to give it some time, you know, compared to, it doesn't have the immediate pleasure that the Serre Nuove has, because, I mean, it does have pleasure, but there's just a richness. It's so much richer and deeper, and there's a concentration and a sweetness that's there that just says, wow, you know, I wish it was 10 years from now to be drinking this. And what do you think is the ideal window to be drinking Ornellaia these days? I mean, I guess it varies from vintage to vintage, but what are your thoughts on that?
as always, you know, they're the ones that open up a little bit earlier, the ones that take a little bit longer. So specifically, each vintage has its own story. But I would say, broadly speaking, for Ornellaia, minimum 8 to 15 years until it really develops fully. Sometimes some vintages take even a little bit longer. You know, 2001 is at age 20 this year, and it's just now hitting what I would think it's ideal drinking peak. And then, you know, here again, it's still a little bit a question of discovery. We now have vintages of Ornellaia that are 30 plus years old, and the least thing we can say is that they're still drinking well. They've held up well. So you'd say 8 to 15 years, and then another 15 years of this plateau phase, and the rest we'll have to see. How long does the plateau last? It's still something to be discovered. I mean, some of the early vintages of Ornellaia are still drinking remarkably well, and quite honestly, I followed them obviously as winemaker for the last 15 years, and they've kept what the French call the rythme de croisière. You know, they're there, and that they seem to be staying there without any signs of fading. So I think actually it's a quite classical aging curve of a you know, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot dominated wine. It's quite similar to the aging curve of a classic Bordeaux. I think one thing that may be an advantage up to a certain point is that there's always this underlying ripeness and sweetness, which makes the wines a little bit more approachable at an earlier stage. I mean, this 2017 is quite a big, structured, powerful vintage, but there's this coating sweetness and intensity of fruit, which makes it still something that is not completely, you know, scaring you off, as sometimes, you know, real hardcore Bordeaux can be or could be, maybe in the past, maybe even in Bordeaux. That's not so much true in recent years.
And now that kind of leads us to 2015, which now this one is not an artist label. So do you release both? I mean, so like, here's the 15. You said you started in 2000 and I forget, it's 2006 or 7 was the first artist year.
Yeah.
And so this one is not. So tell us what's the deal with that?
Well, initially when we did that project, it was only, you know, pieces of art that are commissioned and exposed at the estate. So each vintage has somehow its own piece of art, which is at some place at the estate. And then we did a series of large formats for charity that had labels specifically designed by the artist. Since vintage 2012, we thought we want to introduce that also in the regular bottles of Ornellaia, obviously with one problem which I think everybody will easily understand when it comes to artist labels. It's after Mouton, it's a little bit tough and difficult for anybody to follow. So we said we're not going to add any sort of artwork on all of the labels of Ornellaia. So in order to not, you know, do something that would come off as a copy, we said, let's do one bottle with a different label in a case of 6. So when you have your 6-pack, you'll have 5 bottles with a normal label, and the 6th bottle has a label that is designed by the artist. That's
very cool. So that's obviously the bottle that will get drunk last, I assume, by most collectors, because they like to leave it in the cellar. But that's a nice thing. I like that. I like that a lot, and I like this 15 a lot. I mean, the couple extra years. I mean, this is, to me, an Ornellaia that provides, you know, I'm sure it's because of the differences in the vintages, and also an extra couple of years doesn't hurt, but there's a drinkability here that you start to see now compared to the 17, where you're like, whoa, you know, this is young. And now I don't feel like the 15 is so young, and it's drinking beautifully.
You know, 15 is another of these. I mean, I like to compare up to a certain point 18 and 15. Now, 15 is a vintage that has more stuffing, that has more richness. It's certainly one of the landmark vintages recently, together with 2016. But whereas, you know, 16 and also 17 are wines of structure, wines that have firmness, 15 has always been a sort of gentle and approachable wine. It's richer, it's more concentrated than 2018, but at the same time there is this very soft and engaging silky texture of tannins, which indeed makes it a wine that is already starting to drink very well. At the same time, it's a very classic and typical Ornellaia. This is a vintage where the Cabernet, both Cabernet really play a leading role. There's about 50+% of Cabernet Sauvignon and almost close to 20% Cabernet Franc. So both Cabernets really stand in the foreground. And 15 was definitely a super vintage specifically for Cabernet Sauvignon and to a certain extent Cabernet Franc. So it's really a wine that is already starting to display this sort of tobacco-y, slightly smoky character, with the typical riper fruit you get in Bolgheri. Yes, I think it's a lovely wine, and it's again a wine that will probably have a fairly wide drinking window, because if you have a sip of this glass, you think, if I had to open a bottle tonight for dinner, there would be nothing wrong with that. Right.
I mean, it's beautiful and it's classic. This to me is like a classic Ornellaia. It's just got all the great components, that uniqueness of the Bolgheri region and those little kisses of flavors that come from being in Italy and the Italian soils, and just a beautiful, beautiful wine. Really, really, and even though it feels like, hey, I can enjoy it, it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere too quickly.
No. I mean, some vintages, there are a few vintages that took really quite some time to really blossom. Wines like 99, even 2001, 2006 is still fairly on the young side, and others that reward more drinking pleasure. I think there are sort of two families of great vintages of Ornellaia. The ones that are a little bit bolder, a little bit more structured, a little bit tighter. Those you really need to cellar for at least 10 years before you start drinking them. And then others that are gentle, like 2004, like 2007, or like 2015, that somehow seem to be enjoyable at any stage of their life.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful wine, really well done. And speaking of Ornellaia, you've done a lot of innovations and new things and new wines. I mean, you've added really substantially to the portfolio, right? There's what are the some of the new wines, Lily, that are in the Ornellaia portfolio?
So as I mentioned earlier, there's the Ornellaia Bianco, which we have in the auction tomorrow night, and the Poggio al Gaze dell'Ornellaia, which started in 2009, and then the Ornus, which is a dessert wine. And to me, Italy and Tuscany particularly is known for a few dessert wines that aren't talked about that much, but this one is particularly unique. So Axel, maybe you can talk us through all three, but shed some light on the Ornus as well.
Well, I start with the let's say the oldest of them. You're right to mention that we revived in a certain way Poggio alle Gazze in 2008, 2009 actually. It was a wine that existed before, that had been introduced in the mid-1980s under a slightly different form. So it was a Sauvignon Blanc, pure Sauvignon Blanc, tank fermented, pretty much as what, in the fashion of the day, very much influenced by Loire, probably even more so New Zealand, kind of very varietal driven wine, which is a perfectly nice wine. But at a certain stage we felt, Ornellaia has to do something else than just make a good example of Sauvignon Blanc, which a lot of people can do in a lot of places. So we wanted to give a slightly more complex identity, complex approach to this wine. So we revived in 2008, not completely breaking with the past, still keeping the Sauvignon as a base, but then playing around with other grape varieties, Viognier, which we'd seen some of our colleagues had developed in the area and seemed to give quite interesting results. We also planted Vermentino, because after all, that's a truly indigenous grape variety to the Tuscan coast. And I said, well, at least one we should probably try. And so with a slightly more complex approach in vinification and aging as well, not only tank fermentation, but in part tank, in part concrete eggs, in other parts oak, slightly longer aging on the lees. And after a while, exploring this, we kind of felt, we wanted to make something more ambitious in terms of white wine, but probably if we want to really push that to its pinnacle, then it would have to be called Ornellaia Bianco. So it took us some years until we understood, because we had replanted a lot of new vineyards, until we understood the potential of those vineyards, and until we felt confident enough to say, okay, we have the quality that is high enough so as not to, make us feel ashamed if we put a label that says Ornellaia Bianco on top. So the first time we introduced Ornellaia Bianco was in 2013, which is really meant to be sort of the unidentical twin to the red Ornellaia, but only in the white version. It's a much smaller production because obviously it is possible. I think Italy, most parts of Italy are discovering that they can not only successfully make great red wines, there's also a huge potential to be discovered for white wines, and but probably not quite in the same quantities and the same dimension that we can do for the red wines, because obviously you have to be much more precise in picking vineyard sites, the more shaded ones, the cooler sites, and they're a little bit less frequent than good vineyard sites for red wine. So yes, since 2013, we produced a very small, it's in the 8,000 bottles range, wine called Ornellaia Bianco. And the last year, Ornus, that's a little bit of the wine for families and friends. I must say that I somehow, it's quite odd because I found the vineyard planted when I arrived with Petit Verdot, so that's funny. I mean, okay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, why not Petit Verdot, but really Petit Verdot. And it was actually planted by my predecessor who left the estate before it first came into production. So I must say I didn't necessarily have a huge experience in making sweet white wines, and while I knew Petit Verdot from Jurançon, I knew vaguely what it was supposed to look and taste like. I had no particular experience with the grape, so we played around with it, and we're producing. They're really tiny amounts. We're speaking about 3,000 half bottles, so just a few barrels on a very small vineyard, which is just roughly a bit more than 1 hectare. And although it's so small, we try to do things properly. You pick it in several passages. It's dried fruit rather than botrytis because noble rot is something very hard and very rare to achieve in Bolgheri. And so it's late harvested in different passages, vinified in oak. So we try to make things seriously, but that's really a little bit the wine for families and friends. We serve it very frequently at the estate, obviously, but occasionally we also propose some bottles for sale.
So it's a very interesting wine to hear about because you don't necessarily think of Bolgheri and Bordeaux as kind of cousins in a certain way, but you don't always throw Petit Verdot into the conversation as well.
No, but you know what? The funny thing is that it was present. I mean, there has been a wave. I don't know who came up with the idea, but in central Italy, it was people started to plant it by the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. And so we did in Bolgheri because we saw that, in Lazio, in Umbria, people had planted. And then we realized that it wasn't actually authorized in Tuscany. So it was a small vineyard, it wasn't a big deal. But actually, we were the ones who applied for its authorization then later on in Tuscany. So it's thanks to Ornellaia. If not for anything else, we'll be remembered for the ones who legalized the use of Petit Verdot.
Nice. Well, we have the 2013, which is a great vintage, I believe. And we have, I have the L'Eleganza.
Yeah.
L'Eleganza. Is that you having lunch there in the mountains, or are you one of those three?
Yeah,
people?
together with the artist. It was liquid lunch because the artist didn't care much for solid food. It was either spiritual or on the liquid form.
That's an amazing setting. Where is that?
That is actually, he set up this lunch in the marble quarries of Carrara, where the Carrara marble comes from. So he went up there and shot a little movie about his picnic, enjoying Ornellaia. So the whole art concept was around him going to the place where, Michelangelo and all the others got their marble from.
And talk to us about 2013. This seems to be a truly great wine to me.
Yes, it's probably one of the, it's quite an interesting, it was a very late year. So somehow it expresses a little bit the cooler side of Bolgheri and the cooler side of Ornellaia as well. It's a little bit firmer, it's a little bit tighter than the 2015, for instance. Yep. It's also one of those wines that seem to take a little bit longer to fully blossom, but you can see there's a lot of potential. I think there's a slightly more elegant, complex, and understated expression of Ornellaia, which I very much like.
That's what I like. That's I like that kind of style, that intrigue, that you have to go to it rather than it come to you.
Exactly. It was funny because it was not actually a cool year, because it had one of the hottest and driest summer, but because the vegetation was late, everything ripened after the heat. So the profile of the wines is that of a cool vintage, although most of the summer was actually quite hot. And it made for these slightly, I wouldn't say leaner, but firm and tighter wines, which I very much like.
Right. Yeah, it's a beautiful wine, and in fact, I have I want you to talk a little bit now. I know we're focusing on Ornellaia, and we have some great big bottles of Ornellaia for the auction tomorrow. But just to clarify for the public, I know, of course, you also are the winemaker and director of Masseto, which is a completely different winery run separately. Explain to everybody, the differences. Even though it's part of the extended family, there is a significant difference. And I'm going to just run and grab one more bottle, because I had a special older Ornellaia I wanted to open here that I forgot, but you reminded me when you talked about it. So I'll be right back.
Okay.
So you can tell us about Masseto while he fetches his.
Well, Masseto is first of all an entirely different wine. Obviously, it's from a vineyard that has really turned into its own estate now, with its own winery, its own dedicated team, which I have still the pleasure to oversee. It's a wine that really comes from the most unusual and specific terroir you can think in Bolgheri. It's clay. It's a hill that is, in its best part, it's made out of soils that are made of blue clay on their origin. It's planted with Merlot. Again, it was a little bit of a trial and error approach. When this site was discovered, people, first of all, people had never planted anything there because it had the reputation to have very tough soils. And Masseto, the name means something like hard as a rock. So a place, don't go there because nothing grows. And there was a little house there, and the owner of the house is supposed to have given this name because he's complaining because his vegetables didn't grow. You could do nothing. Now, when you're making wine, usually when somebody tells you there's this soil where nothing grows, it's terrible, then it's usually one you should take into account for making wine, because usually when nothing else grows, it's a perfect place for making wines. So the next question was, what do we plant? And nobody had quite a clue. And very simply, people said, it's blue clay. It rings a bell somehow. So why don't we try Merlot, without having any sort of guarantee that would make a great wine? And after a few years, the results were that compelling that it was decided to make it a wine on its own, and now today a full-run estate. Its originality comes from this terroir and this combination of Merlot in a very Mediterranean climate. So it's something that is intuitively not supposed to work, and yet it gives a very, very special expression of that grape variety. Masseto is a rich and ripe and concentrated wine, but at the same time a very focused, a very bright wine, which is something that seems a bit strange for Merlot, because it has the reputation when it gets too hot, when it gets too dry, to get overripe, to get flabby, to lack acidity. And nothing of that takes place at Masseto. It's really a truly Mediterranean expression of Merlot, which somehow manages to all the exuberance and ripeness without losing the focus and the freshness. So it's a great privilege to be able to be involved in both estates, obviously Ornellaia, because it's really a wine that speaks of the area, that speaks of Bolgheri, and Maceto, which is really its own unique terroir and a very, very original and particular expression of Merlot.
Yeah, and the new winery is breathtaking. It's one of the great places to visit. I mean, just an absolutely spectacular, the cellar, the tanks, everything about it. Just from it's one of the most beautiful wine places in the world to visit, to match the beautiful vineyards that you have in Bolgheri. It's really breathtaking and exciting. Exciting what you guys have done.
Yeah, we're feeling a little bit alone these days because since there have been very few visitors.
I think 2022 you're gonna be getting bothered a lot again in 2022. I have a strong feeling. So I pulled something out of my personal little cellar here, an 01 Ornellaia. You reminded me. I wanted to make sure. Of course, it was before your time, but still a great wine, and nice to see something new. I got excited after having these young primary vintages that still, the 15 and 13, I still could, enjoy it no problem and drink a bottle tonight, like you say. But it's nice to see something like the 01. I wanted to share with you, and you can see like the richness and the sweetness develop. I mean, talk to us a little bit about 01. It's kind of a famous vineyard in Tuscany, but how was it in Bolgheri by comparison?
It's still one of our true benchmark vintages, I think. And we've been working since the early 1990s with Michel Roland, who still is our consultant winemaker. And he always told me he thought maybe until 2016, but he told me, to me that is the closest to perfection I've seen as a vintage in Bolgheri. I think today, the only thing that was probably missing in 2001 was a bit more vine age, because after all, the oldest vineyards were barely 20 years old, and a lot of the vineyards were still less than 15 or 10 years old. So the same vintage, had it benefited from an average vine age of 20 or 25 years, as is the case today, God knows how great it would still have been. But it was an almost perfect growing season. And I find that I've always felt this wine was a benchmark to me as well in terms of style. It's really that wine that combines the sweetness, the exuberance, the ripeness, together with a great sense of precision and firmness and tightness. So never a wine that is just all over the place, that invades your palate just with gobs of ripe fruit and sweetness. Yeah. But there's always been great focus and great tension and great nervosity to this wine.
And you can really see
when I joined Ornellaia in 2005, that was still a very young wine. So you could tell that it was a potentially great wine. But what is particularly great to me now, that I've been able to follow the evolution of this wine, and now I finally see this wine getting where it was supposed to age into. Right. Today, one of the great privileges of being at Ornellaia is that some of the early great vintages that we had towards the end of the 1990s and early 2000s are the first fully mature great examples of Ornellaia. Before, we didn't have. In 2005, when I joined, I wasn't tasting one wine from which I felt this is absolutely at its peak. So there were all promises, and there was still a sense of the unknown. How are these wines really going to age as well as we hope they will? Now, today, we're one step ahead, and we open bottles like 2001, like 99, like 98, like 97, and they really show us what Ornellaia looks like when it's perfectly peaking. Peaking on the early side, I think, when it comes to 2001, it's still a wine that has a lot of energy, a lot of structure, a lot of tannins. So I think there's still some more to come, but it's definitely one wine. If you want to take a look at an Ornellaia that is really fully peaking, or close to fully peaking, then that's definitely a nice one to take a look at.
Yeah, it was. It's delicious, and I mean, it has that sweetness, and it's on that plateau, and it's not going down, but it's there. You know, it's there, and you know, this is the first one where now it's like, wow, it's like almost that little Pomerol kinky fruit. I'm kind of starting to get that Merlot is expressing itself, and I could see it and taste it. It's just a real pleasure, especially after having these young bucks and these adolescents that are still appreciable and enjoyable. But I couldn't help it. You mentioned 2001. I was like, oh wait, I had a 2001, and I had to run and get it and share it with you and such. And Axel, thank you so much. It's always great to spend time with you. You are one of the most knowledgeable people in the world of wine. I think we need to get you an Italian passport and a Great Britain passport, and then maybe a role in a James Bond movie, and then you know you'll be set. We need you in there somehow. You are the secret agent of fine wine, and it was a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much, and continue all the great things you're doing at Ornellaia and at Macedo.
Well, thank you for having me. Great to see that you just, you know, took one older vintages out of your sleeve, because it's maybe the one thing that was the perfect conclusion to this tasting. So I hope you have a great success, and I hope that next time we meet, it's going to be either in Bolgheri or in New York or wherever, but you know, face to face, sharing a good glass or a good bottle of wine.
Absolutely. We've done some great tastings together, and we'll do many more for sure. So thank you again, Axel, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, and salute. Cheers.
Cheers.